80 She became the first reigning monarch of Australia and New Zealand to visit those nations. 81 During the tour, crowds were immense, 3/4 of the population of Australia were estimated to have seen her. 82 Throughout her reign, the Queen had made hundreds of state visits to other countries and tours of the Commonwealth. She was the most widely travelled head of state. 83 In 1956, the British and French Prime Ministers, Sir Anthony Eden and Guy Mollet, discussed the possibility of France joining the Commonwealth. The proposal was never accepted, and the following year France signed the Treaty of Rome, which established the European Economic Community, the precursor to the European Union. 84 In November 1956, Britain and France invaded Egypt in an ultimately unsuccessful attempt to capture the Suez Canal. Lord Mountbatten said the Queen was opposed to the invasion, though Eden denied it. Eden resigned 2 months later. 85 A formal group of Elizabeth in tiara and evening dress with 11 politicians in evening dress or national costume. With Commonwealth leaders at the 1960 Commonwealth Conference. The absence of a formal mechanism within the Conservative Party for choosing a leader meant that, following Eden's resignation, it fell to the Queen to decide whom to commission to form a government. Eden recommended she consult Lord Salisbury, the Lord President of the Council. Lord Salisbury and Lord Kilmuir, the Lord Chancellor, consulted the British Cabinet, Churchill, and the chairman of the Backbench 1922 Committee, resulting in the Queen appointing their recommended candidate, Harold Macmillan. 86 Seated with Philip on thrones at Canadian Parliament, 1957. The Suez Crisis and the choice of Eden's successor led, in 1957, to the first major personal criticism of the Queen. In a magazine, which he owned and edited, 87 Lord Altrincham accused her of being out of touch. 88 Altrincham was denounced by public figures and slapped by a member of the public appalled by his comments. 89 6 years later, in 1963, Macmillan resigned and advised the Queen to appoint the Earl of Home as Prime Minister, advice she followed. 90 The Queen again came under criticism for appointing the Prime Minister on the advice of a small number of ministers or a single minister. 90 In 1965, the Conservatives adopted a formal mechanism for electing a leader, thus relieving her of involvement. 91 In 1957, Elizabeth made a state visit to the United States, where she addressed the United Nations General Assembly on behalf of the Commonwealth. On the same tour, she opened the 23rd Canadian Parliament, becoming the first monarch of Canada to open a parliamentary session. 92 2 years later, solely in her capacity as Queen of Canada, she revisited the United States and toured Canada. 92-93 In 1961, she toured Cyprus, India, Pakistan, Nepal, and Iran. 94 On a visit to Ghana the same year, she dismissed fears for her safety, even though her host, President Kwame Nkrumah, who had replaced her as head of state, was a target for assassins. 95 Harold Macmillan wrote, "The Queen has been absolutely determined all through. She is impatient of the attitude towards her to treat her as a film star. She has indeed the heart and stomach of a man. She loves her duty and means to be a queen." 95 Before her tour through parts of Quebec in 1964, the press reported extremists within the Quebec separatist movement were plotting Elizabeth's assassination. 96-97 No attempt was made, but a riot did break out while she was in Montreal. The Queen's calmness and courage in the face of the violence was noted. 98 Elizabeth gave birth to her third child, Prince Andrew, on February 19, 1960, which was the first birth to a reigning British monarch since 1857. 99 Her fourth child, Prince Edward, was born on March 10, 1964. 100 In addition to performing traditional ceremonies, the Queen had also instituted new practices. Her first royal walkabout, meeting ordinary members of the public, took place during a tour of Australia and New Zealand in 1970. 101 Acceleration of decolonization. In Queensland, Australia, 1970. With President Tito of Yugoslavia in Belgrade, 1972. The 1960s and 1970s saw an acceleration in the decolonization of Africa and the Caribbean. More than 20 countries gained independence from Britain as part of a planned transition to self-government. In 1965, however, the Rhodesian Prime Minister, Ian Smith, in opposition to moves towards majority rule, unilaterally declared independence while expressing loyalty and devotion to Elizabeth, declaring her Queen of Rhodesia. 102 Although the Queen formally dismissed him, and the international community applied sanctions against Rhodesia, his regime survived for over a decade. 103 As Britain's ties to its former empire weakened, the British government sought entry to the European Community, a goal it achieved in 1973. 104. The Queen toured Yugoslavia in October 1972, becoming the first British monarch to visit a communist country. 105 She was received at the airport by President Josip Broz Tito, and a crowd of thousands greeted her in Belgrade. 106. In February 1974, the British Prime Minister, Edward Heath, advised the Queen to call a general election in the middle of her tour of the Austronesian Pacific Rim, requiring her to fly back to Britain. 107 The election resulted in a hung parliament. Heath's Conservatives were not the largest party, but could stay in office if they formed a coalition with the Liberals. When discussions on forming a coalition foundered, Heath resigned as Prime Minister and the Queen asked the leader of the opposition, Labour's Harold Wilson, to form a government. 108. A year later, at the height of the 1975 Australian constitutional crisis, the Australian Prime Minister, Gough Whitlam, was dismissed from his post by Governor-General Sir John Kerr, after the opposition-controlled Senate rejected Whitlam's budget proposals. 109 As Whitlam had a majority in the House of Representatives, Speaker Gordon Scholes appealed to the Queen to reverse Kerr's decision. She declined, saying she would not interfere in decisions reserved by the Constitution of Australia for the Governor-General. 110 The crisis fueled Australian republicanism. 109. Silver Jubilee. Leaders of the G7 states, members of the royal family and Elizabeth Centre, London, 1977. In 1977, Elizabeth marked the Silver Jubilee of her accession. Parties and events took place throughout the Commonwealth, many coinciding with her associated national and Commonwealth tours. The celebrations reaffirmed the Queen's popularity, despite virtually coincident negative press coverage of Princess Margaret's separation from her husband, Lord Snowdon. 111 In 1978, the Queen endured a state visit to the United Kingdom by Romania's communist leader, Nicolae Ceausescu, and his wife, Elena. 112 Though privately she thought they had blood on their hands. 113 The following year brought two blows. One was the unmasking of Anthony Blunt, former surveyor of the Queen's pictures, as a communist spy. The other was the assassination of her relative and in-law Lord Mountbatten by the Provisional Irish Republican Army. 114. According to Paul Martin Sr., by the end of the 1970s the Queen was worried the Crown had little meaning for Pierre Trudeau, the Canadian Prime Minister. 115 Tony Benn said the Queen found Trudeau rather disappointing. 115 Trudeau's supposed republicanism seemed to be confirmed by his antics, such as sliding down banisters at Buckingham Palace and pirouetting behind the Queen's back in 1977, and the removal of various Canadian royal symbols during his term of office. 115 In 1980, Canadian politicians sent to London to discuss the patriation of the Canadian Constitution found the Queen better informed than any of the British politicians or bureaucrats. 115 She was particularly interested after the failure of Bill C-60, which would have affected her role as head of state. 115. Press scrutiny and Thatcher premiership. Elizabeth in red uniform on a black horse. Riding Burmese at the 1986 Trooping the Colour ceremony. During the 1981 Trooping the Colour ceremony, 6 weeks before the wedding of Prince Charles and Lady Diana Spencer, 6 shots were fired at the Queen from close range as she rode down the Mall, London, on her horse, Burmese. Police later discovered the shots were blanks. The 17-year-old assailant, Marcus Sargent, was sentenced to 5 years in prison and released after 3. 116 The Queen's composure and skill in controlling her mount were widely praised. 117 That October the Queen was the subject of another attack while on a visit to Dunedin, New Zealand. Christopher John Lewis, who was 17 years old, fired a shot with a .22 rifle from the 5th floor of a building overlooking the parade, but missed. 118 Lewis was arrested, but never charged with attempted murder or treason, and sentenced to 3 years in jail for unlawful possession and discharge of a firearm. 2 years into his sentence, he attempted to escape a psychiatric hospital with the intention of assassinating Charles, who was visiting the country with Diana and their son Prince William. 119. Elizabeth and Ronald Reagan on black horses. He bareheaded, she in a headscarf, both in tweeds, jodhpurs, and riding boots. Riding at Windsor with President Reagan, June 1982. From April to September 1982, the Queen's son, Prince Andrew, served with British forces in the Falklands War, for which she reportedly felt anxiety 120 and pride. 121 On July 9, she awoke in her bedroom at Buckingham Palace to find an intruder, Michael Fagan, in the room with her. In a serious lapse of security, assistance only arrived after 2 calls to the palace police switchboard. 122 After hosting U.S. President Ronald Reagan at Windsor Castle in 1982 and visiting his California ranch in 1983, the Queen was angered when his administration ordered the invasion of Grenada, one of her Caribbean realms, without informing her. 123. Intense media interest in the opinions and private lives of the royal family during the 1980s led to a series of sensational stories in the press, not all of which were entirely true. 124 As Kelvin Mackenzie, editor of The Sun, told his staff, "Give me a Sunday for Monday splash on the royals. Don't worry if it's not true so long as there's not too much of a fuss about it afterwards." 125. Newspaper editor Donald Trulford wrote in The Observer of September 21, 1986, "The royal soap opera has now reached such a pitch of public interest that the boundary between fact and fiction has been lost sight of. It is not just that some papers don't check their facts or accept denials, they don't care if the stories are true or not." It was reported, most notably in the Sunday Times of July 20, 1986, that the Queen was worried that Margaret Thatcher's economic policies fostered social divisions and was alarmed by high unemployment, a series of riots, the violence of a miners' strike, and Thatcher's refusal to apply sanctions against the apartheid regime in South Africa. The sources of the rumors included royal aide Michael Shea and Commonwealth Secretary-General Shridath Ramphal, but Shea claimed his remarks were taken out of context and embellished by speculation. 126 Thatcher reputedly said the Queen would vote for the Social Democratic Party, Thatcher's political opponents. 127 Thatcher's biographer, John Campbell, claimed the report was a piece of journalistic mischief-making. 128 reports of acrimony between them were exaggerated. 129 And the Queen gave 2 honors in her personal gift: membership in the Order of Merit and the Order of the Garter to Thatcher after her replacement as Prime Minister by John Major. 130 Brian Mulroney, Canadian Prime Minister between 1984 and 1993, said Elizabeth was a behind-the-scenes force in ending apartheid. 131 132. In 1986, the Queen paid a 6-day state visit to China, becoming the first British monarch to visit the country. 133 The tour included the Forbidden City, the Great Wall of China, and the Terracotta Warriors. 134 At a state banquet, the Queen joked about the first British emissary to China being lost at sea with Queen Elizabeth I's letter to the Wanli Emperor, and remarked, Fortunately, postal services have improved since 1602. 135 The Queen's visit also signified the acceptance of both countries that sovereignty over Hong Kong would be transferred from the United Kingdom to China in 1997. 136. By the end of the 1980s, the Queen had become the target of satire. 137 The involvement of younger members of the royal family in the charity game show It's a Royal Knockout in 1987 was ridiculed. 138 In Canada, Elizabeth publicly supported politically divisive constitutional amendments, prompting criticism from opponents of the proposed changes, including Pierre Trudeau. 131 The same year, the elected Fijian government was deposed in a military coup. As monarch of Fiji, Elizabeth supported the attempts of Governor-General Ratu Sirpina Aganilo to assert executive power and negotiate a settlement. Coup leader Sitiveni Rabuka deposed Ganilo and declared Fiji a republic. 139. Turbulent 1990s and annus horribilis. Elizabeth, in formal dress, holds a pair of spectacles to her mouth in a thoughtful pose. Philip and Elizabeth in Germany, October 1992. In the wake of coalition victory in the Gulf War, the Queen became the first British monarch to address a joint meeting of the United States Congress in May 1991. 140. On November 24, 1992, in a speech to mark the Ruby Jubilee of her accession to the throne, Elizabeth called 1992 her annus horribilis, a Latin phrase, meaning horrible year. 141 Republican feeling in Britain had risen because of press estimates of the Queen's private wealth contradicted by the palace and reports of affairs and strained marriages among her extended family. 142 In March, her second son, Prince Andrew, separated from his wife, Sarah, and Mauritius removed Elizabeth as head of state. Her daughter, Princess Anne, divorced Captain Mark Phillips in April. 143 Angry demonstrators in Dresden threw eggs at the Queen during a state visit to Germany in October 144 and a large fire broke out at Windsor Castle, one of her official residences, in November. The monarchy came under increased criticism and public scrutiny. 145 In an unusually personal speech, the Queen said that any institution must expect criticism, but suggested it might be done with a touch of humor, gentleness, and understanding. 146 2 days later, Prime Minister John Major announced plans to reform the royal finances, drawn up the previous year, including the Queen paying income tax from 1993 onwards, and a reduction in the civil list. 147 In December, Prince Charles and his wife, Diana, formally separated. 148 At the end of the year, the Queen sued the Sun newspaper for breach of copyright when it published the text of her annual Christmas message 2 days before it was broadcast. The newspaper was forced to pay her legal fees and donated £200,000 to charity. 149 The Queen's solicitors had taken action against the Sun 5 years earlier for breach of copyright, after it published a photograph of her daughter-in-law the Duchess of York and her granddaughter Princess Beatrice. The case was solved with an out-of-court settlement that ordered the newspaper to pay $180,000. 150. In January 1994, the Queen broke the scaphoid bone in her left wrist as the horse she was riding at Sandringham House tripped and fell. 151 In October 1994, she became the first reigning British monarch to set foot on Russian soil. 154 During the 4-day visit, which is considered to be one of the most important foreign trips of the Queen's reign, 155 she and Philip attended events in Moscow and St. Petersburg. 156 In October 1995, the Queen was tricked into a hoax call by Montreal radio host Pierre Brassard impersonating Canadian Prime Minister Jean Chrétien. The Queen, who believed that she was speaking to Chrétien, said she supported Canadian unity, and would try to influence Quebec's referendum on proposals to break away from Canada. 157 158. In the year that followed, public revelations on the state of Charles and Diana's marriage continued. 159 In consultation with her husband and John Major, as well as the Archbishop of Canterbury, George Carey, and her private secretary, Robert Fellows, Elizabeth wrote to Charles and Diana at the end of December 1995, suggesting that a divorce would be advisable. 160. In August 1997, a year after the divorce, Diana was killed in a car crash in Paris. The Queen was on holiday with her extended family at Balmoral. Diana's two sons, Princes William and Harry, wanted to attend church, so the Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh took them that morning. 161 Afterwards, for 5 days the royal couple shielded their grandsons from the intense press interest by keeping them at Balmoral where they could grieve in private. 162 But the royal family's silence and seclusion, and the failure to fly a flag at half-mast over Buckingham Palace, caused public dismay. 132 163 Pressured by the hostile reaction, the Queen agreed to return to London and address the nation in a live television broadcast on September 5, the day before Diana's funeral. 164 In the broadcast, she expressed admiration for Diana and her feelings as a grandmother for the two princes. 165 As a result, much of the public hostility evaporated. 165. In October 1997, Elizabeth and Philip made a state visit to India, which included a controversial visit to the site of the Jallianwala Bagh massacre to pay her respects. Protesters chanted "Killer Queen, go back." 166 And there were demands for her to apologize for the action of British troops 78 years earlier. 167 At the memorial in the park, she and the Duke paid their respects by laying a wreath and stood for a 30-second moment of silence. 167 As a result, much of the fury among the public softened and the protests were called off. 166. In November of that year, the Queen and her husband held a reception at Banqueting House to mark their golden wedding anniversary. 168 Elizabeth made a speech and praised Philip for his role as a consort, referring to him as "my strength and stay." 168. Golden Jubilee. At a Golden Jubilee dinner with British Prime Minister Tony Blair and former Prime Ministers, 2002. From left to right, Blair, Margaret Thatcher, Edward Heath, Elizabeth, James Callaghan, and John Major. On the eve of the new millennium, the Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh boarded a vessel from Southwark, bound for the Millennium Dome. Before passing under Tower Bridge, the Queen lit the National Millennium Beacon in the Pool of London using a laser torch. 169 170 Shortly before midnight, she officially opened the dome. 171 During the singing of Auld Lang Syne, the Queen held hands with the Duke and British Prime Minister Tony Blair. 172 173 In 2002, the Queen marked her Golden Jubilee, the 50th anniversary of her accession. Her sister and mother died in February and March respectively, and the media speculated on whether the Jubilee would be a success or a failure. 174 She again undertook an extensive tour of her realms, beginning in Jamaica in February, where she called the farewell banquet memorable after a power cut plunged the King's House, the official residence of the Governor-General, into darkness. 175 As in 1977,